I'd like to express how honored I am to speak before you today at the OPITO Global 2018 conference. I think a lot of us wonder how we will react to uncertain times, how we'll face challenging situations that surround us. Well, today I'm going to tell you the story of U.S. Airways Flight 1549, the miracle on the Hudson. But beyond that, I'm going to go and tell you how an industry transformed itself to improve and address safety and how that aided Sully and I on this day. Now, we're going to do that by putting you on the jump seat. And you're probably asking yourself, what's a jump seat? Well, in the United States, the cockpit is a high security area. And very, very few people other than pilots themselves are allowed access. Inside that cockpit, there's a jump seat. It's a little seat that folds out from the wall. And today I'm going to put you on that jump seat by bringing you along with me and telling you my story. Now, to your left, you're looking at Captain Chesley Burnett Sullenberger III. That's quite a name. In the course of the trip prior to this actual accident flight, we were up at altitude. We were flying a 5-hour flight from Charlotte, North Carolina to San Francisco. And we were talking, I'm looking at my trip sheet, which is a piece of paper we carry, which has the names of all the crew members, our route of flight, when we have to get up the next morning, be there for the flight, that sort of thing. And I'm looking at this name that takes up the entire space that's allotted for a name on the trip sheet. And I said, so Sully, I said, with a name like this, it must put a lot of pressure on a man to produce a Chesley Burnett Sullenberger IV. Well, Sully looked at me very seriously, because he's a very serious man, and he says, Jeff, that is exactly why I adopted 2 girls. The name had to end with me. Now, Sully learned to fly, or grew up, I should say, in Denton, Texas, and he learned to fly as a teenager. He got an appointment to the U.S. Air Force Academy, where he excelled, as Sully has excelled in all things in life, and he got his choice of training when he got out, and he wanted to be a fighter pilot. So he trained in F-4 Phantom fighters in the 1970s. He separated from the Air Force, as many people do, and was hired at Pacific Southwest Airlines, which is one of the airlines that grew and merged in to become U.S. Airways on this day. To your right, as you're sitting on that jump seat, is me, Jeff Skiles. I also learned how to fly. As a teenager, I'm what they call a civilian pilot. I taught people how to fly while I was going to college, and I've been working for U.S. Airways since 1986. In the back are 3 highly trained flight attendants, Donna, Doreen, and Sheila. Between them, they had over 90 years of experience as flight attendants. Their business is your safety, and they train rigorously for that. Now, I find that people like to tell me where they were when they first saw the first pictures or heard about this incident. And I don't know where you were, but I'm going to tell you where I was. By the time you join us on that jump seat in LaGuardia, the low clouds and snow that occurred earlier in the day had been pushed out by a cold front that had moved through. The skies had cleared, but it had turned noticeably colder. We had 150 passengers join us on this day, an absolutely full flight. You're watching Sully and I at the gate accomplishing our flows. We use the exact standardization of our cockpits to our advantage. An airliner that is the airline might purchase today is going to be substantially the same as the same airplane that they bought 20 years ago. The reason is because having a completely standardized work environment is so important to us as pilots so that we can interact with the technology. We often don't fly with airplanes that have the latest technology because of that. But that interaction between the pilot and the machine is so important that we feel that should be the emphasis for us. We do our flows, then we discuss our departure in a standard format that we call a takeoff briefing, and then we accomplish a checklist, a list of things to do in between us. And it's very short because we've already prepared the cockpit and the airplane through our flows. And it's just to maybe triple check things that are very important, such as fuel on board the airplane. Now, this is the last day of a 4-day trip for us. We go out on multiple day trips. And for me, I have just been released from training. I just finished training on the Airbus 320 just the Friday before. This is my very first line trip on the airplane. As pilots, we can only be qualified on one airplane type at a time. And once again, it's that standardization. It's to keep us from making an error at a critical point. As soon as I started training on the Airbus 320, my qualification on the Boeing 737 that I had been flying for the last 8 years expired. It's not only a new airplane for me, it's also my first flight with Sully. At the time, he'd worked at the airline for 30 years. I'd worked there for 24. And I don't ever even recall seeing the man before. But that is absolutely normal when I go to work. When I go to work, I will most likely be flying with people that I have never met. Now, you'd think that would be hard for us to act as a team, but that's why we have to adhere to our training and to our procedures, our systems, so that we can act as a team from the very first moment that we sit down together. We start up our engines on this cold 20-degree Fahrenheit day, so that's obviously something minus in centigrade. Taxi out to the end of the runway, and we're holding short of runway 4. I'm going to be flying this leg. Normally the pilots swap legs as they go through the trip. The captain will fly one leg, the first officer will fly the next. It just happened to be my turn to fly. Our air traffic controller clears us into position and hold. Sully taxis the airplane out. He lines it up with the center line stripes, comes to a stop, and he sets the parking brake. And he says, "Your aircraft." And I said, "My aircraft." And that's the terminology we're required to use to verbalize transfer of control. We're clear for takeoff. I reach over in between us, grab the big thrust levers and push them up into the takeoff and go around detent. The engines start to whine as they spool up. As we move down the runway, Sully makes our standard callouts of 80, V1, rotate. And those are all airspeeds, and they mean something to us as pilots. Below 80 knots, we will abort a takeoff for virtually any reason. But above 80 knots, we will only abort a takeoff for an engine failure, an engine fire, or perception the airplane cannot be flown. Above V1, we will go ahead and fly even though we're still on the runway, even if we do lose an engine. This is the kind of structure that helps us to make decisions in a time-constrained environment. But today we don't have any problems. And we lift off the runway. Sully calls positive rate, meaning we're climbing, and I commanded gear up, and he raises the landing gear. I turn to a heading in north, which is our assigned heading for departing LaGuardia, and begin to raise the flaps as we continue our climb. Now, about 3,000 feet in the air, which isn't very high at all, I'm just pitching the airplane over to accelerate, and something catches my eye. And I look up, and slightly higher than you would normally look, and slightly to the side, I see a line of Canada geese, very large birds. And they're far too close to maneuver around. In an airliner at 200, 250 knots of airspeed, by the time you see a bird, it's really too late to do anything about it. You can't fly around them. I remember this feeling of shock, but then I thought we were going to climb over the top of them. But unfortunately, our engines and our wings hang below my line of sight. Next to me, I hear Sully say birds, and then in a split second, we were on top of them. Their bodies were impacting on the engines, on the wings, the fuselage. And unfortunately for us, 2 of these very large birds went through the core of each engine. When you look at an engine from the gate, you're looking at the big fan section, which is this big, large disc of blades. If you were able to look at that engine from doing a walk-around inspection like I do, you see there's a much smaller turbine and compressor section behind there, which has 17 more discs of these spinning blades. And we were unfortunate enough to take 2 birds right through the critical area of both engines. I remember after the impact thinking that we had to assess what the damage was. And then after a split second, both engines immediately lose thrust. That high whining sound that they make at climb power was just reduced to nothing. The shock of it was tangible. You have this kind of confusion in your mind at first, and with the suddenness of it. It's what they call the startle reaction now in the industry. We have the nose up in the air. We're at our minimum airspeed for our flap configuration, and you can just feel the airplane sag in the air. You can feel the deceleration. I'm looking at the airspeed tape unwinding in front of me, and I push the nose forward to get the airplane in a glide. And then Sully decides to take over control of the airplane, which is his option as the captain, and he says, "My aircraft." And I thought to myself, "Your aircraft?" But that's actually a signal. Normally, when we go through the day, we constantly cross-check each other to use two sets of eyes and two brains on everything that we do to try to trap errors. But when we have emergency situations, we know we have more ground to cover. And one person primarily flies the airplane. The other person handles the emergency. With Sully saying, "My aircraft," I knew that my role had changed to troubleshooter. And I reached forward and grabbed my quick reference handbook, which is a big book of emergency procedures that we have out and placed in a certain location so that we can grab it very fast. Now we've got the airplane in a glide. We're just over 200 knots of airspeed. We're only descending about 1,000 feet a minute, which isn't a very high rate. Swept-wing airplanes actually glide fairly well. But we're only at 3,000 feet to start with. You can do the math. Our right engine is completely destroyed. It's turning at just a very slow speed. Our left engine is doing better. It's running, and it's giving us about idle thrust, but no more. But the important part for us is it was running a generator and a hydraulic pump, because an Airbus is a fly-by-wire airplane, meaning that you need both electrics and hydraulics for the control surfaces to even move. Back in the cabin, our flight attendants know that something has gone horribly wrong. But they sit in a jump seat where they don't even have a window, and they can just wonder about what's going on. Our passengers have heard, and in some cases seen, the birds impacting the airplane. There's torching on our left engine as the fuel nozzles were knocked out of the burner cans and were going around the engine and igniting in the slipstream. But as bad as that is, most people thought that we've got an engine fire, but surely we'll be returning to land on the engine on our right. They didn't know that that one was completely shut down and destroyed. Now back up in the cockpit, I find the right checklist, the dual engine failure checklist, which denotes the procedure we're supposed to follow. But when I find it, it was really designed for a different scenario, as if you're at high altitude, 30,000 feet, and you had a fuel exhaustion, or perhaps you flew through volcanic ash. The checklist is 3 pages long, and it wasn't designed to be done at 3,000 feet in 3 minutes' time. Next to me, Sully's calling Mayday, 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 declaring an emergency. Mayday is a term used for ships or airplanes in distress. It's actually a French word. Mayday means help me in French. When our air traffic controller hears that Mayday call, he turns us to a heading of 220 degrees magnetic. And that's a standard procedure for them. They've thought through this. If somebody declares an emergency taking off from runway 4, you turn them to 220 degrees. And the reason is because it puts them into a nice position to come back around and land at the airport, if that's possible. But for us, it lined us right up with that Hudson River. And we looked at that and knew that that was something that we could use going southbound. Now I'm going through our checklist, resetting computers to make sure we have our speed information indicating properly, making sure we have electrics and hydraulics so that we can fly, and trying to restart these engines through a very involved procedure but we're far outside of the start envelope. We're not going fast enough to spin the engines to get them started. Next to me, Sully's talking about going back to LaGuardia with our air traffic controller. And I can't see it because it's on his side of the airplane and it's kind of behind the airplane. But he doesn't think that we could make it. Our air traffic controller points out Teterboro Airport, which is off to the right in that photo. It's an airport that's used for corporate aircraft. And I remember pausing in my checklist, looking at it out there, and then I started to see it rise in the windshield, which to a pilot means you can't stretch your glide. LaGuardia Airport, Teterboro, or the Hudson River were really our only choices to set down the airplane. As you can see, this is one of the most congested areas on Earth. It's full of skyscrapers, roads, houses. If we were going to set down the airplane in the city, it would be an absolute disaster. Our air traffic controller stopped all departures from LaGuardia and Teterboro, and he's clearing airspace for our distressed aircraft. He points out Teterboro to us, but Sully tells him that we can't make it. And with that, the Hudson became our only choice for landing the airplane. But it's broad and it's flat, and a much safer option than having to set it off across an inhabited area. What I remember the most about that descent to the river was all the noise in the cockpit. We have many, many warning systems that warn us of various alerts. We got what we call a GPWS, Ground Proximity Warning System alert, a whoop whoop pull up call out. We came too close to an airplane that was flying up the Hudson River going northbound, and we're getting a call out over our speakers saying traffic, traffic. The continuous voice is saying too low gear, meaning the gear is not, we're descending to the airport or to the ground and the gear is not down. And our alert bell is sounding continuously, warning us of these cascading failures of the systems. But we're so overloaded in our minds that we don't even hear it and we don't cancel it. Through all this noise, Sully has the presence of mind to reach back and grab the public address telephone and give the command to the cabin. This is the captain. Brace for impact. And this is a signal to the flight attendants to start into their emergency preparedness procedures. They start chanting, brace, brace, heads down, stay down. Brace, brace, heads down, stay down, over and over and over again. Now with this, our passengers know that they're not going to be returning to land in an airport. And they handled it in a number of ways. Some of them wrote notes to put in their shirt pockets to leave for their loved ones. Many of them texted their families on the phones that were supposed to be shut down when they left the gate. One passenger showed me his text 3 years later. He didn't want to give up that flip phone he had, even though we moved into an era of smartphones, because he didn't want to lose that text. He texted his wife, and he said, "The plane's going down. I'll always love you. Say goodbye to the kids." One passenger I know had 2 days of bad luck. Just the day before, his wife had been diagnosed with breast cancer. Thankfully, she's completely recovered. But he was a spiritual man. And he told me, he said he'd made a pact with his God. And of course, he said, "God, if you have to take somebody, please take me." So here it is, less than 24 hours later, and he's plummeting to the earth in this engineless aircraft. He doesn't even know what the next few seconds of his life are going to hold. And he told me, he said, all he could think about was, "God, I know we made this pact, but did it really have to be so soon?" Back in the cockpit, we have to start slowing up the airplane. We're going too fast, and at this airspeed, we'll break apart when we touch the water. So we put down our flaps and slats, which are the devices on the leading and the trailing edges of the wings that you see come out when you come into land in an airplane. And this allows us to slow down to our absolute minimum airspeed to stay in the air of 135 knots. Now, Sully needs to land with the wings perfectly level to keep from possibly digging a wingtip and cartwheeling the airplane. But one of the many fortunate things that day was that the river was calm, because they can actually get swells in the Hudson River. And more importantly for us, and amazingly to New Yorkers, there were no boats in our way. It's a very heavily trafficked waterway. The airplane hit hard on the tail. The river just seemed to flow over the airplane. Water cascaded up into the windshield. But then it popped up, and it was just bobbing in the waves, the way you see in the picture. I turned to Sully and I said, well, that wasn't so bad. But he's already realized that we've lost all electrical power. And the flight attendants are waiting for him to command the evacuation. They're waiting for him to say, evacuate, evacuate. So he goes back and commands the evacuation. I stayed up front and did an emergency evacuation checklist. We have a procedure that we can go through even for that. Now, our flight attendants didn't even know that we had landed on the water until they opened the door and they saw the Hudson River. We didn't have the time to tell them. But they instantly changed their commands to don life vests, come this way. Now, the landing seemed okay, frankly, up front, in the front of the airplane, but it was pretty severe in the back. The belly had ripped out of the airplane. The tail was filling with water. The rear baggage hold had pushed up through the floor of the rear galley, and a structural member, essentially a piece of angle iron, had come right through the floor and had embedded itself in Doreen's calf, where she was sitting on her jump seat in the back of the airplane. Blood is spurting from her wound, but she doesn't realize it because she's in shock. The passengers rush to the back of the airplane, but Doreen knows that she can't open the doors back there or it'll let the water in. So she gets them turned around and headed back forward to the overwing exits of the airplane. Now, by the time I go back, the passengers are rapidly exiting the airplane. The first 10 rows or so are already empty. Several of them had jumped into the freezing water thinking that they were going to swim to shore, but they wouldn't have gotten 10 feet. The water temperature was about 2 degrees centigrade. It was very, very cold. They had to be helped back onto the airplane and onto the wings. I helped the last of the passengers off, and then Sully and I went back to about mid-cabin over the wings. And we were getting seat cushions and life vests to hand out to the people who were standing on the wings with no place to go. The water where we were was absolutely freezing cold. Any part of your body that was in that water just ached to the bone. I started walking on the seats and the armrest to keep my legs out of the water, but I still had to reach down underneath the seats into that ice water to get the life vests where they hang in pouches below the seats. The passengers were incredibly admirable in this situation. They helped each other. There was no pushing, there was no shoving, but these are what I would call professional passengers. This wasn't a families going on vacation. This was a Thursday afternoon commuter flight out of New York City for able-bodied adults such as yourself. There was only one elderly person on board. There was only one family with 2 children. In fact, 8 of our passengers were so unfazed by the experience that as soon as they got to the ferry dock, they just walked right through, went out to the curb, hailed a cab, went back out to LaGuardia, and demanded to be put on the next flight to Charlotte. Now, back in the cabin where I am, the plane is filling up with water, but I was never more than maybe 20 feet from one of those emergency exit hatches, so I never really was concerned for my own safety. I thought I could probably swim for it if it suddenly acted like it was going to sink. And after some period of time, and Sully and I had cleared out all the life vests and the seat cushions in the area, and he stands up before me and he says, "Jeff, let's get out of here." And we went back up forward and went out through the normal boarding door that you board the airplane through. And I remember this odd sense as I got into that doorway because it was calm inside the airplane. It was just Sully and I, and we didn't really know what was going on outside. And when I stood up in that doorway, there was just pandemonium around the airplane. There were boats already surrounding us. There was a police helicopter overhead dropping a frogman in the water. And the helicopter blades were kicking up spray that was just drenching everybody with cold water. In our raft were Sully and I, our A flight attendant Donna, and an overload of passengers who were all wet and cold. I cut the tether that was holding our raft to the airplane, and we floated around the nose of the airplane. And one of the big passenger ferries that carries people back and forth between New Jersey and Manhattan Island comes up right next to us, and he reverses his engines and comes to a stop. And then a crewman came out and he throws a boarding net over the side for us to climb up onto the boat. And he throws a rope over at me, and I'm supposed to hold on to the rope to keep the raft next to the boat. But I can't even grip anything with my hands anymore. I've been in that cold water too long. I remembered I held the rope in my elbow while I was kind of leaning up against the side of the boat, sitting still on the raft, while the passengers started up that boarding net. And after a while, I hear Sully behind me say, "Jeff, we better get out of here while we still can." And I turned around and I was surprised that the raft was empty. It was full of passengers, but they had all gone up onto the boat without my really realizing it. So we clambered up as best we can, up the boarding net, and got into the airplane, or onto the boat. And I walked into kind of the heated area. And right where I walked through the door, there was one of our passengers. He had a flip phone. He just flipped it shut. And he looked at it and he offered it to me. And I thought, well, maybe I should call somebody. Well, it was the last day of a trip, and my wife was expecting me home, so I thought, well, I'll call my wife. Tell her I'm probably not going to be home tonight. So I dialed the number. She answers, and she says hi, and I said hi. And I don't know, with all the shock and awe of the last 20 minutes, I thought that I had to get off that phone as soon as possible. And I said, well, I don't think I'm going to be home tonight. And of course, she says, why? And I said, well, we took off from LaGuardia, we hit birds, we flamed out both engines, we had to ditch the airplane in the Hudson River. We think we got everybody out okay. I got to go. And I hung up. Now, fortunately, none of this, or where this happened, was very close to the 42nd Street ferry terminal on the Hudson River. So it was only about 5 minutes before we felt the airplane actually touch at the dock. The entire flight took 5.5 minutes. 2 minutes from takeoff to hitting the geese, 3.5 minutes to land in the Hudson River. It's taken me 6 times that long just to tell you about it.
Cactus 1549, 700, landing 5,000.
Cactus 15.9, departure to contact line, maintain 15,000.
Maintain 15,000, Cactus 1549.
Cactus 15.9, turn left lane 270.
This is Cactus 1539, hit birds, so you're lost thrust on both engines, returning back towards LaGuardia.
Okay, you need to return to LaGuardia. Turn left heading up 220.
220.
Tower, stop your departures, got emergency returning. It's 1529. He bird strike. He lost all engine. He lost the thrust in the engines. He's returning immediately.
Cactus 1529. Which engines?
He lost thrust in both engines. He said.
Got it.
Cactus 1529. We can get it for you. Do you want to try to land runway 13?
We're unable. We may end up in the Hudson.
All right, Cactus 15.9. It's going to be left traffic to runway 31.
Unable.
Okay, what do you need to land? Do you want to try to go to Teterboro?
Yes.
Teterboro, Empire, actually, LaGuardia departure guy, emergency inbound.
Hey, got it.
Cactus 1529 over the George Washington Bridge, wants to go to the airport right now.
Wants to go to our airport. Check. Does he need assistance?
Yes, it was a bird strike. Can I get him in for runway 1?
Runway 1, that's good.
Cactus 1529, turn right 280, you can land runway 1 at Teterboro.
We can't do it.
Okay, which runway would you like at Teterboro?
We're going to be in the Hudson.
I'm sorry, say again, Cactus? Cactus 1549, radar contact is lost. You also got Newark Airport up at 2 o'clock in about 7 miles. Eagle Flight 4718, turn left thing 210.
210, 4718. I think he said he was going in the Hudson.
Cactus 1529, you saw him?
We weren't at the ferry dock long before the politicians arrived. Mayor Bloomberg and Governor Patterson of New York State came down to hold a press conference on site where we were about something that Sully and I thought we were the only ones that could know what possibly happened. But this is where Governor Patterson coined the phrase, the miracle on the Hudson, which is what this has been known as ever since. But let's talk about why we were successful from an industry standpoint, from a pilot standpoint. Now, first of all, I'd have to acknowledge that Sully is the most professional and capable airline pilot that I have ever flown with. He certainly represents the finest of our profession. And our flight attendants, Donna, Sheila, and Doreen, showed incredible bravery in calmly evacuating the passengers. Their job is truly passenger safety. But we were a team, Sully and I, Donna, Sheila, and Doreen. But we weren't alone that day over the Hudson River. And we weren't alone because of the revolution that has occurred in safety engineering in the industry within my 32-year career. An airline cockpit is a bit different than most corporate offices. Decisions that can have a major impact on safety, on profits, even on efficiency, filter down to the frontline employees like pilots in the cockpit. You must make a decision and you must live with the consequences. There's no ability to find out what your boss wants to do about something. And that's why it's critically important for safety managers to plan for all possibilities and to give frontline employees the guidance and the tools to act positively and correctly in even the most unlikely scenarios. And this is an important point. Management's role in aviation often isn't in making the right decisions, but rather management's role is arming their employees with those tools and procedural training and team structure to make the proper decisions in the field. But to understand where we are today, you really have to understand where we came from. When I first entered the industry in the 1980s, we didn't have any of the tools that we have today to help us and to address a situation of this consequence. Safety efforts had been primarily focused on making the machine better. We have GPS navigation devices that can navigate us around the globe with pinpoint accuracy, sophisticated autopilots that can land the airplane in 0-0 visibility, and many warning devices to help the pilots by warning us of various failures of systems. But even so, accidents still persisted. And as we eliminated mechanical reasons for accidents, the one glaring cause that wasn't affected, that continued to cause accidents, was what we call pilot error. A mistake not caused by the machine, but by the human beings who are operating it. Little emphasis had been placed on making the people better and giving them the tools to react with each other and with our amazing technology. The safety system was invested in the individual, the captain. But an airliner was moving too fast and had become too complex for one individual to always be in complete control of every issue. To change, we needed to move to a team-based approach. We needed to embrace 3 basic principles. We needed to spread accountability by adopting that team-based approach to flying. We had to develop common procedures that we could and have every single pilot following those procedures before we could identify weaknesses in our system. And we needed to develop a near-miss reporting system so that we can monitor things that are happening in real time and change our procedures to meet developing threats. In the early 1990s, we underwent training to give us interpersonal skills and to communicate and work better with each other as a team. Sully was, in fact, an early facilitator of this, teaching the course, so to speak. Within a couple years, we actually started training jointly with the flight attendants, the entire team, so that we could learn the challenges that they face in the back, behind that cockpit door that we never imagined. We learned to accept and appreciate the value of all employees and the role that they play in and outside the cockpit. Most importantly, this was compounded by our airline management with every communication, and it became an integral part of our training environment. Today, we work seamlessly in the cockpit. Any error or omission by one person is caught by the other pilot. No offense is taken if you point out that somebody just heard something wrong or set a control improperly. The training we underwent changed to emphasize leadership and management skills rather than just focusing on technical ability. But merely teaching leadership does not make a team. A team needs structure to be successful. And structure needs to be developed by the organization as that framework from within which individuals can succeed. You heard some of the tools that we use today to create this structure in my narrative: checklists, flows, quick reference handbooks, call-outs, briefings, procedures. We have manuals that define expectations for every single moment of a typical flight, and even for flights where we have challenges. They're called standard operating procedures. Something as simple as setting our altitude alerter. And when I first got hired at the airline, if they changed our altitude, they said climb to 10,000 feet. The pilot flying would reach up, change the altitude alerter, which is kind of between the two pilots on the glare shield, to 10,000 feet, and we'd start the climb. There was no check. Turns out people oftentimes didn't climb to the right altitude. They heard the altitude wrong. They set the altitude wrong. There's a lot of possibilities for error. So we created a procedure. Now, if I'm flying and I set 10,000 feet, then I have to point to it and I have to say 10,000. And the other pilot has to point to it and say 10,000 as well. Then we can both release our fingers. It sounds like it's fast once you get used to it, 10,000, 10,000, and you move on to the next thing. But it's amazing how many errors you trap that way, because the one pilot just heard the altitude wrong, or he just said it improperly. There's no point in even arguing about it or even saying, I thought it was 10,000. You simply pick up the microphone and ask the controller, could you repeat that altitude again to solve the impasse. These are the tools and tools like this that we use to seamlessly interact with the aircraft and with each other in even those most adverse situations. They help us to make the right decisions in the field without the assistance of our superiors further up the corporate ladder. With these techniques, we trap mistakes before they lead to an adverse outcome. And we practice using these and acting as a team in our training scenarios. While we obviously still have to prove our technical competency, the emphasis now is placed on communicating, utilizing all resources, and managing problems to a successful conclusion. As I said, management creates the environment in which employees can be successful. But safety managers need to have that visibility over what's happening in the organization, over the challenges that their frontline employees are facing daily. So we develop near-miss reporting systems, which actually sounds a little bit more dramatic than they are. They're simply a way that we can report and point out things that could possibly be a safety inhibitor. The primary means we have is by a simple reporting system, where it's a computer program or computer form that we have to fill out. We have to do it within 24 hours of being in an incident. Let's say I leveled out at the wrong altitude, and it caused a possible conflict with another airplane. I can report that to the company. Why would I report that to the company? Well, first of all, I can be part of the safety system, but more importantly for me personally, I get immunity from any retribution for it. We actually have a signed legal agreement between the government administrator, our airline, our pilots association, saying that if we fess up and say we made a mistake, but here's the situation around it and here's why I think it happened, we're absolved of any responsibility for it. Why would you do that? Well, the reason is because punishing somebody for just being human, for making a mistake, doesn't solve any problems. But giving that visibility over that mistake, and perhaps finding out that it's not just you, that it's 5 other guys just this week, that gives safety managers the ability to identify things that scream out for an organizational solution, developing a procedure to address that. It's not important who made the mistake. What is important is how we react positively to that. That's how we use adversity to reach even greater heights. Now, every report that I send in is broken down into data points. The aircraft type, the phase of flight, where it happened, when it happened, so that we can track these things and find out that there perhaps is a problem with Airbuses crossing a certain altitude going into Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the afternoon when they use a certain arrival. And safety managers can really drill down and identify the problem and find a solution for it. We also have observers that ride on our jump seats and they watch everything we do. They note anything that is an absolute procedure. When the flight is done, they leave. They don't tell us what we did wrong. That's not the point. The point is getting data and finding out. They go back and they report that maybe Sully said 80 knots instead of 80 on takeoff roll. And if we find out that that's a problem that exists throughout the organization from this reporting, they will address it in our training, or perhaps create a new procedure to trap an error. We also have the airplanes actually automatically downlink certain parameter exceedances. The point is to gain data, to see if many people are making the same mistake. All this data is compiled and tracked by our safety department to watch for those trends, those threats to safety that are experienced not by the individual, but by the group. And that last statement is very important. Most people learn from their own experiences, maybe anecdotally from people that they know. That's why experience in any role is considered to be so valuable. But through these mechanisms, we learn through the experiences of the entire pilot group. Where I work now, over 15,000 pilots. Through this threat and error management, we identify the smaller mistakes that exist in the environment, whether they be human, mechanical, or situational. And we devise procedural solutions to trap those mistakes before they ever lead to an accident. I'll give you one example. We used to have a problem with high-rated descent approaches. It's not anybody's fault, but you're coming down, maybe the controller holds you high, or you misjudge your altitude, and you find yourself below 1,000 feet, maybe going too fast with a high rate of descent because you're trying to land the airplane on the runway, you're trying to make it work. And of course, because we're skilled pilots, virtually all the time, we make it work. But it's not necessarily a safe operation, because you're utilizing the very edge of your skills instead of being right in the center of your skill level. They used to put these posters on the wall in the crew room showing the scenarios, how that they were 30 knots fast on their approach speed, which is a lot. Maybe coming down to 2,000 feet a minute, which is a lot. And the idea was to educate, and maybe it would solve the problem. Didn't address the problem. So they created a procedure. Now, when I come into land, I'm flying the airplane, there's an automated voice that says 1,000, meaning radar altimeter. That's your 1,000 feet above the ground. I have to be within 10 knots of my airspeed that we've decided that we're going to approach at. We have to have our flaps set. We have to have our before landing checklist complete. We have to be less than 1,000 foot per minute vertical descent, essentially a safe, stabilized approach. And I actually have to say the word stable. And if I can't say the word stable because I don't meet any of those parameters, I have to say go around and come back in and land and try it again. At 500 feet in the air, the other pilot who's not flying says stable. So we've got 2 checks on that. That's the way of creating a procedure to address errors to try to, that have never really caused necessarily an accident, but certainly have the potential to down the road. This safety system becomes the predominant driving force of everything we do. But what about that human element? Human beings are capable of great things, but they also have known faults. We get distracted by personal difficulties. We just get tired at the end of a day. We spread ourselves too thin with multitasking. Within a strong safety culture, we don't tell people don't get tired. We acknowledge that these errors will happen, and we don't place blame. Instead, we create those organizational, those procedural barriers to counteract that threat before it becomes an adverse outcome. So what does this lead to? You know, when I started in this industry, we had airline accidents in the US maybe once every year or every 2 years. My own airline had 5 fatal crashes in 5 years from 1987 to 1992. That was about the time we started to bring all these procedures into effect. Today, the last fatal accident in the US, and the US are the primary users of these procedures, and United Airlines and US Air developed them. But the last fatal accident in the US was in 2001. We've had 17 years with a perfect safety record because of these systems and how we have changed how we operate. We use the tools provided by the organization, checklists, briefings, call-outs, flows, to reduce error. We develop common standard operating procedures to support employees to be successful, and we constantly test those standard operating procedures with near-miss reporting. This is how you learn and grow as an organization. So let's bring this back to the cockpit on that day. 20 years ago, Sully would have been incredibly task-saturated. He would have to have flown the airplane, been responsible for restarting the engines, had to do everything, really, where I would have been just waiting for orders that he would have been too busy to possibly give. Today, we divide those duties. Sully chose to fly and talk on the radio. All I needed to hear was him say, "my aircraft," and I was launched onto a new path as a troubleshooter. I immediately picked up my quick reference handbook, found the proper emergency procedure, and started into it. All of our flight attendants had to do was hear the words brace for impact or evacuate to command their pre-planned and trained procedures. There wasn't a lot of verbal communication between Sully and I over the river. There didn't need to be. We never made eye contact, but we knew what was in each other's minds. We accomplished our individual roles, but we also worked together seamlessly in this very stressful situation. Even in the most challenging circumstances that I will ever experience, communication did not break down. The team did not break down. And remember, this didn't occur from years of working together. I'd only met Sully 3 days before at the beginning of this trip. It was our training, our procedures, and our systems, the tools provided to us by our airline management. So what do I want you to take away from this? Sully and I were prepared and trained to handle this crisis. We were prepared and trained because of the leadership showed at all levels of the organization, because of the willingness of the organization to look inward and question what we do and continuously change to meet developing threats, and to place primary emphasis on supporting frontline employees like Sully and I so that we can be the very best that we can be. Those principles have value in your business as well as in mine. So was this miracle in the Hudson truly a miracle? 30 years ago, I would have said yes. But today, I would tell you that we were successful because of the vast support system that allowed Sully, Donna, Doreen, Sheila, and I to act correctly and positively in our moment of crisis. Our success was due to decades of preparation, and represented the life work of innumerable people who created our systems and procedures. In aviation, we had spent decades making the machine safer, but only by focusing on people and giving them the tools to be successful and to interact with our amazing technology could we truly achieve real safety in the airline industry. I have one final message for you today, but first I'd like to open it up for a couple of questions. Now, while Rico's getting ready for that, I'll start you out with one that I get asked a lot. What happened to everybody afterwards? Certainly, I don't want to downplay the fact that there's a lot of post-traumatic shock and things that you have to deal with afterwards when you crash an airplane and your whole life is being an airline pilot. Sully was off for about 9 months, and he came back to work then, although he actually only flew 3 instances after that, and I flew 2 of those with him. But he was going on to become, much bigger. He had a very successful career as an author, as a speaker. Sully has excelled at everything that he has done in life. He's been a great example for me. I was only off for about 7 weeks. I went back to work. I was just tired of just waiting. I wanted to move forward with my life, so I went back to work right away, actually. 2 of our flight attendants, Donna and Sheila, they were off for about 1.5 years before they came back, and neither of them work there now. In fact, I'm the only one that continues to still work. And Doreen, who was injured, she was in the back of the airplane. She never flew again. She told me once, she said she could never be alone in the back seat, or in the back jump seat of an airplane again. So she just left the industry and quit. So I'd like to open up for questions.
Let's give a big round of applause to Jeff Skiles. Oh my God. Just listening to you there in my seat gave me a lot of goosebumps. Wow.
Thank you.
You're indeed a hero. And of course, Jeff, the miracle in the Hudson happened on January 15, 2009. So we're like 2 months away from the 10th anniversary.
That's true. That's true. It's our 10th anniversary in 2 months. The passengers like to have reunions. I'm kind of hoping that 10 years kind of puts it to rest myself.
So what about Aaron Eckhart? Did he give a genuine portrayal of you in that film?
Actually, I only got the opportunity to talk to him on the phone for maybe about a half hour. He called me very close to when they were going to start the filming. So I never got the opportunity to meet him until later after the film was actually made. But my friends tell me that even with that, he managed to capture my smart-ass personality perfectly.
Do you have any questions from the delegates? Any questions for Jeff Skiles? You know, Jeff, you're still flying now with American Airlines.
Yes.
You pilot a 787, and you fly to Asia once in a while, to Shanghai and Narita. From 2009 all the way up until 2018, of course, we've had more newer models of Airbuses and Boeing aircrafts. Have procedures, safety procedures, changed or evolved from 2009 until today?
Oh, certainly procedures have evolved. That's the one benefit of, not the one, but one of the benefits of near-miss reporting is you're constantly changing. They're constantly evolving, trying to make things better. Sometimes you'll institute a new procedure that actually causes more errors in a different way, and then they will revisit it. But the way airlines work is they have an overall safety system, but airliners themselves, different types of airplanes, Boeings, Airbuses, they have their own philosophies on things in many cases. So the fleet types will have to find their own procedures oftentimes to address the overall safety mandates from the airline. So because of that, when you get a new airplane type, you have to reevaluate and change the procedures on that particular airplane type so that you can meet the same safety standards of the airline as a whole.
But most of the safety standards from 2009 really still hold up until today.
That's true. You know, when we started this, change was very rapid. We were constantly changing procedures, testing new things, but now we've gotten to a place where really it works. Haven't had a fatal crash in 17 years on U.S. carriers. So we have a system that works now. So change is not as common. The other thing is we also have people, young people, who were brought up in this system, so they're used to it. For me, it was a dramatic change from the very hierarchical, almost military system that we had when I started at the airline, where the captain was, you know, he was like the general, and the co-pilot was the corporal, and you just followed orders. Now we work as teams, and we're very, very comfortable with working with each other.
So it's all about teamwork. But of course, you know, the buzzword right now in many, many industries is about augmented reality, artificial intelligence, innovation, financial technology. All these things come into play in many industries. Does it have a place in the airline industry?
You know, I'm sure it will, but it's going to be decades in the future. And the reason is because the airlines, because of how they operate, are very slow to react to new technology. And the reason I even talked about it a little bit in my speech is that we have to have a common work environment. Like they will buy something like an Airbus 320. The airline has been purchasing these for over 20, 25 years now. Airbus makes that airplane. They make them in generations. There's not a new model year. There's not a 2018 Airbus 320 that has all kinds of improvements over the 2017. They are the same aircraft. And the reason is so we can have that absolute standardization. Most technological improvements don't actually address safety. They don't make things safer in the airline industry. There have only been 3 things in my entire career, and I'm in my 33rd year now, that where a device came along that they actually introduced it in the entire fleet in the course of operation. Otherwise, we simply do without until they retire that particular fleet and introduce a new, more modern fleet of aircraft. But it's because having that absolute standardization of cockpits of airplanes is so important to us and pilots and how we work.
All right, do we have any questions? Yes, ma'am. The mic is all the way there at the back. We'll just have to wait for Megan until she comes forward with the mic. Thank you very much. If you could please identify yourself. Delay.
Thank you. Hi there. I'm Helen Bates from BP. And Jeff, that was a really powerful story. Thank you for sharing. How important was it that you'd been through simulations prior to that incident? You say it was quite an unusual incident, losing both engines at that height, but similar scenarios, similar simulations, that's something that you go through on a regular basis as a pilot, I understand. How important was that you'd been through similar a number of times to enable you to respond appropriately?
It's very important. And I have to go through a training scenario every 9 months at my own airline right now. But we are really emphasizing practicing on how we work together as a team. It's not necessarily the particular emergency, because that's just what you're addressing at the moment. But how we work together as a team, how we use the checklist, do we use our proper call-outs, do we use our standard operating procedures? Because these are all developed so that we can work together. So that in our case, Sully can do his part, I can do my part, but between the two of us, we have done everything. And that's something that we practice religiously in our simulator periods. In fact, it used to be when you took a check ride, it was a test. You know, it was like getting a driver's license. This is a test. So you had to learn how to parallel park, and you had to learn how to do all this stuff. You had to demonstrate all that stuff. Now, what we call maneuvers, engine failure on takeoff, engine fire, whatever. Those are, in our training scenario, our only actual test is a regular line flight where some little emergency presents itself. Maybe it's something like a generator failure. It's not even anything necessarily that's a big deal. But we are being rated, what we're being tested on is how we react to it. Do we utilize all the resources? Do we call up our dispatcher? In my case, I'm an international pilot. Do we call the pilots on break and get them back up to the cockpit? What they're doing is they're testing how we manage and react to this situation. So simulation is very, very important in developing that.
All right. So we'll have to eat a bit into our coffee break. We have another question here.
Yeah, thanks very much. I was interested that you talked about the reporting culture and you talked about the immunity you have in the aviation industry for reporting. One of the issues we have in our industry is a lack of reporting. So what prompted, or was any specific incident that prompted that to change? And is it only in the US or is it global?
All US carriers have adopted it. Most European carriers have as well. It is something that obviously it works, so it's expanding throughout the world. Not just the reporting systems, but how that fits into the entire safety management systems. I have to say that I don't really know how it started, where it came from, where the idea first was introduced. But it is critically important because there are things that top-level managers, even mid-level managers, just never have any visibility on. The people who are facing these problems day to day, they just deal with it, they react to it. Maybe they deal with it badly or well, but it's a problem that could have an organizational solution. So that's where having these safety reporting systems are so critical, because you might know if you have a problem, but you don't know if virtually everybody in this room has had the same problem. And in that case, if it's a problem that you just have, then okay, maybe it was just you were tired, you missed something on that particular day, not a big deal. You're human, you can't change that. But if it's a problem that everybody at your table has had, then it's something that screams for an organizational solution. And that's where managers need to get involved. So having that oversight is so critically important, that visibility is so critically important.
Any more questions? Yes, sir. Last question. Gentlemen.
Hi, Tony Ward, Aberdeen Drilling International. One quick one there about it. You said you've got standard operating procedures. Are they developed company by company or nationally, or is it right through the industry?
That is an interesting question. The way the Federal Aviation Administration in the US works is they have regulations, and the airlines can, as long as they meet those regulations, they can do what they want. So these standard operating procedures are airline by airline. They create their own. But that's not to say that it's something that's done in a vacuum. For instance, even with safety reporting. With safety reporting, you can't share the circumstances of a near-miss incident outside the corporate shell in the US, because then it makes it, if it's shared outside the corporate shell, it can be used in litigation against the company. So, but if it's contained within the corporate shell, it's quality assurance data. But what we do is every 3 months we have what we call info share, where all of the airlines will get together and they will talk about their experiences. And perhaps Southwest Airlines will say, we've been having a lot of problems with this, or a lot of incidences of this particular error in our pilot group. And this is the solution that we've come by, and it works pretty well. And therefore, safety managers can take that back to their own airlines and look a little more closely to see, are we having that same problem and we just haven't realized it yet? And maybe we'll adopt that procedure. So because of that, the procedures are actually fairly uniform across different airlines, but it isn't because there's a federal or a worldwide mandate to do so.
And Jeff, having flown more than 25,000 miles in your career, looking at the trends going forward, what else would you like to tweak? What what could be, what other safety procedures would you like to add to the manual?
Well, I've flown 25,000 miles isn't much these days. I have about 25,000 hours in the air.
25,000 hours.
Which is,
I stand corrected.
Which is several years if you figure it out, if they were all end to end. But as far as safety, I think we are in a very, very safe time right now. I mean, certainly there are accidents, and fatal accidents. There's a tragic Lion Air accident, and we don't know what caused that, whether it was mechanical or whether it was human or perhaps both. And it's being investigated right now. But we are in a very, very safe time in aviation, which really shows how these systems, how trying to address safety, proactively is really working in the aviation industry and could work in many industries. There are many, many different industries that I think are very close. I think your own industry would be able to use many of these procedures very effectively. The medical industry is very close to airlines. They have their own challenges within the medical industry, but they can also adopt many of these procedures that we use, and they in fact have to great success. So I'd like to wind up by simply saying that the story of Flight 1549 is a story of people, and people who had a role to play, and they played those roles flawlessly. Sully and I, Donna, Sheila, Doreen, our air traffic controllers, the passengers themselves, the boat crews, the helicopter divers, and the innumerable people behind the scenes that have created and continue to improve on our amazing safety systems, all had a role to play in the miracle on the Hudson, whether great or small, but every one of them was critical to the outcome, because if even one had failed, there would have been no miracle at all. That's my story of U.S. Airways Flight 1549.